Okay, so we went through. We're talking about females in the Bible, and of course, I decided to hit all the most controversial parts first. And we talked, the first time about like leadership roles and things like that. And I basically went through like what was usually considered like the fivefold ministry, looking at a pastor, evangelist, and all those roles, and showed how you can find like a female can fit in each of those. You can find examples of females who have fit all of those roles. And then we talked a little about how the pastor is the weird one, how there's literally no explicit reference to a male or female pastor. And then we talked about how the only other time that word pastor is used in context, usually it's the word itself actually means a shepherd. And the only other time that's actually used of anybody of gender is literally just Jesus. So, there's a little bit of interesting things that go there. And last week we addressed the whole awkward question is, can a female teach? Sort of thing. And we went through kind of going a lot through the issues of some of the crazy things that Paul says, right? And one thing that kind of constantly came up is how when you look at all of those verses, it's weird. Well, not weird, but it is weird, I guess. But all of the those verses that seem to be, that tend to be controversial for a lot of people, realistically, all that really comes down to is the issue is they're all confined to marriage in some sort of way, and that's what we talked about. Now, this week we're going to talk about norms between genders. This is somewhat of an interesting one. You don't have to worry. This won't be too crazy. This theoretically should have been short. Was what I was originally planning, but we'll see how it happens. The reason why I brought this up is because then you look at all these sort of things, and if you're looking at this from a perspective of the history of what we have with people, of humanity, the question then slowly starts becoming, once you start looking and diving more into a biblical view of how females are portrayed in the Bible, you start asking sort of questions of what is the actual role of male and females and different things like that. And we're not going to dive too much into the full aspects of that, but we're going to talk about a handful of things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about one crazy thing that Paul says. We're going to basically go through 1 Corinthians 11, because he has several things in here that's just crazy. But we'll go to 1 Corinthians 11, 2-3. So here's one thing that becomes kind of interesting. Now, on the one hand, we talked about sort of this idea like of female leadership and stuff like that, and we can find that in various ways throughout the New Testament, especially, and the Old Testament. But what becomes kind of interesting is when you look at things from the context of marriage, it's very clear throughout Scripture that the man is in charge of the household and different things, and that's where when you go back and look at a lot of things that Paul says, that's kind of where the dynamic kind of goes back and forth, where most of those issues that we usually talk about in the church to defend certain views, most of it is confined towards marriage. Now the question is, what the heck is Paul talking about here? Okay, so the word head here is literal. The word in the Greek literally just means like a head. Like it's literally just someone's fake, like actual head. Oftentimes, symbolically, it can be used to talk about a position of authority is one thing that could be talking about in like symbolic terms. Then we get to John 6, 37. Now, this becomes kind of interesting because when you look here, you find that the Trinity has some sort of order within it in some way, and it becomes kind of interesting. Because here we have God, we have the Father, we have Christ, and then of course when you talk about the church, how the church is looked as the bride of Christ. Now what's interesting is how the bride is given to Christ, how the Father gave him the authority for that. Then you can kind of look like what Paul was kind of talking about, how like when you look at the head of the household and different things like that, we find that order is still kind of broken down in a similar way. We're going to shift a little bit and go back to talk more about some of the interesting things about some females in the Old Testament, because that tells us a lot and this is really where I kind of wanted to kind of address most of the talking about like norms of today and our standards and things like that. Because so the question is, does the Bible match our perception of society? That's a really good question, doesn't it? Right? Because on the one hand, we're going to say no, not quite, but on the other hand, we ask ourselves the other question: did the Bible match people's perspective of society in the past? And I want to make an argument that it probably didn't either. It didn't match it before, and it doesn't match it now. That might sound kind of intuitive, but then you look at Deborah, and I mentioned. What
do you mean by match?
That's what we're going to talk about. So when you look at Deborah, and you can go to Judges 4 to 5, there's a lot of very interesting things in this in this area that you can dig around and actually find, because on the one hand, chapter 5 is basically like a whole like song that she writes to God and different things like that. But when you look through chapter 4, she's a prophet, she's a writer, she's a judge, and just so you're aware, judges back then were partly kind of the same idea of judges that we have now, where like they proceed over court cases and different things like that, and they give wisdom to people. But the judges were also literally like the spiritual leader of Israel at that point, and they were the ones that led that led all of Israel, and kind of helped like that God used to kind of corral everybody into a sort of neat pile that wasn't trying to destroy itself at every moment, And the judges had a very interesting role in that aspect. Now we have Barak, who was basically a military leader, and he actually goes up to her first to actually he goes up to her for help for this war that's going on to help fight things off and stuff like that. He refuses to go to battle unless she comes with him. It's interesting how God gives her insight to a bunch of different things, and it's because of this that she gets the plan to kind of go off and kind of like God kind of helps instruct her to give the plan to Barak. Now, when you step back and you look at, and the reason why I bring this up, because historically speaking, if people just literally read through Judges 4, you have all these sort of questions. Well, can women be in the military? Can women command? Can women, like, literally this one lady back then has already like shocked almost all of our history of what we believe how women can do different things. And when you step back here, and it's kind of amazing how like the Bible it's amazing how like most of the issues we talk about in a lot of like Christian stereotypes and stuff like that really just comes down to misinterpreting Paul's like arguments talking about marriage to then applying that to every situation. Which when you look at a lot of those things, it's like you think someone would have sat there for a while and been like, why is every single time Paul's talking about being submissive and different things like that, he's always talking about marriage? And it's always seemed to be in a lot of the language that he talked about, which is why like last time I talked about submissive and different things like that. There tends to be a lot of spiritual disorder that's going along with that, not just this issue of like marriage. There's a lot more going on in there. But in any case, there's another interesting thing too, is that Deborah, if you read the chapter, she doesn't want any credit for killing the enemy and all this and that. And what's actually kind of interesting is she actually kind of prophesies that a woman will actually get the credit for killing him. Now, the reason why that's kind of interesting is because I went through some things, and I didn't want to bring up a whole bunch of like literature and stuff like that, but like apparently Deborah was like regarded as a very, very fair judge in the fact that she was like the best possible person you can find to what was it? Be a leader. She was like leadership 101. Like a lot of like different historical and rabbinical traditions like really regard her as like top tier in leadership. And it's interesting how like she's one of the first examples we find of that in the Bible. Now, of course, unfortunately, we don't get a whole like. There's a lot you can diagram from that chapter, which really tells you a lot. But from a lot of like the Jewish like traditions and everything like that, they regarded her as a very, very high up leader, and like so much so that like a lot of leadership and things like that, when people talk about leadership and they actually study this, especially like looking at females and things like that, she's usually one of the first examples they go to, which is kind of interesting. So much so that they even say that she wasn't impartial in any sort of way. Like if there was any sort of like problem that was going on that came to her, she was very fair. And like they usually talked about, and it's another thing that was interesting is how she's one of the only leaders in the Bible that she's one of the few leaders I'd say, because I don't think there's another example that I've seen, but she's the only person that people don't rebel against. Think about that. People rebelled against Moses. They got mad with Aaron. I mean, people rebelled against Jesus. I mean, against our own pastor. Yeah. Even like when you look at like Jesus' disciples, like they even abandoned him. I mean, like, and when you look at that and how compared to like Deborah, how she's portrayed, like there's nothing really wrong about how people like saw her. And of course, you ask some questions. Well, can women be military commanders? And you ask some other things. Well, can she, like in our modern context, can women be judges? And I mean, arguably, she was a judge. So, I mean, in that sense, Then we talk about some other things. Are there actually differences between men and women? Now, obviously, you'd think this would be straightforward answer, yes. Okay, there's clearly differences. We're not going to go through a whole discussion going through fully through this topic, because I wanted to kind of, I figured most of this would be pretty straightforward. I just wanted to talk a little bit about some things on here. We find that God designed man and woman, by the way, in case you didn't know. What's interesting is that, and this is where I put some videos in the slides so that you can kind of look at them for your own time, because it's kind of interesting how oftentimes when people look at and they say that men and women are exactly the same, usually what people, and this is what a lot of psychologists and different things have actually found, is that when you look at personality traits and different, and this is personality traits, but you can talk about physical traits and different things too. But there's a lot of distribution of how those things are laid out, right? And when you look at people around the average man and woman in terms of personality, they can share traits and stuff like that. That's not much of a problem. But what you find is how that's distributed. Men tend to overwhelmingly show more traits than females in the way it's distributed, and it's kind of a weird thing to look at. But like one thing that kind of comes up often is how men and women actually express these differences are very pronounced. And you can go through some of the videos that I showed that kind of they talk about that in a lot of different ways. But one thing that you find is that like for instance, in the way that like career choices are made. Like I remember there was I was watching this one of the videos that was talking about how you look at like the top 5 paying like careers in America right now. And the only one of them that was overly dominated by women was pharmaceuticals. But you have like petroleum and you have all these other things that is like almost at least 80% male. And then it was interesting because it was talking about how when you look at the 5 least paying jobs, like they were all dominated by women except for one. Does anyone want to guess what that one role that was dominated by man that was the lowest paying? Not construction. What was it? Not nursing. What was it? Not janitor. Theology and religion. Basically pastors is like the lowest paying job. It's one of the 5 lowest paying jobs, and it's overwhelmingly male, which is kind of interesting. But it's even interesting how like, because when you look at the task, because like it talked about one of the other like common jobs that females tend to take that's in the lower percentile is actually social work, and overwhelmingly that's dominated by females. But what's interesting is when you look at the psychology of those jobs, it's very demanding in different aspects in both ways. And that's where you start finding that, like multitasking, like arguably men and women can multitask. But in general, females do it better than men. Which becomes kind of interesting because you look at like a whole bunch of other things too. Like for instance, like if we think of things that are usually motherly and different things like that, like taking care of children and different things like that, those are traits that generally go along with actually being able to multitask, where men don't multitask because we like to focus on one thing at a time. And most of the jobs that are associated with that, like pharmaceuticals is one thing because there's a lot of things going on. But then you have like, like petroleum and other things. Those are very like pinpointed tasks. Then you think about theology. Theology, you're usually thinking about one task and you're hyper focused on talking about God in some specific aspect. All the other jobs, they're not necessarily, they're like, you can have those traits in other jobs and different things like that, but the way men and women express it are very different. And that's just some things talking about that, because we could talk about biology and a whole bunch of other things, but I don't want to go there for today. I just wanted to kind of give that overview, just kind of because we're talking about norms, right? And mostly social norms. And God designed males and females to be different, and they actually occupy different roles. Even in marriage, they like when God talks about in Genesis, man, how he created female to be the helper of man. So and this is actually something I wasn't planning to go on this in my notes, but have you ever thought about this? God created a perfect world. Perfect garden. Placed man in the center of it. And yeah, and God was there, right? And God was there. And yet man was still lacking one thing. He still needed a helper. He's in this perfection, and yet God recognizes that there's still something else missing. But anyway, talking about norms. I bring that up is to talk about Deborah because it's interesting how she's the only female judge that you really find, right? The reason why that's interesting is to talk about how, we've gone through talking about how, you can find females in leadership positions, stuff like that. And I brought up this whole thing talking about how men and women tend to express things differently. And the reason why that's interesting, it's not that females can't take leadership roles or things like that. It's just in general, men tend to do that. Which is interesting how with Deborah, she's the exception to the rule. It's not that females can't do it, but just on average, more men are going to do it than females. And it's not like it's a bias between men or females are better, different things like that. It literally depends on the context. But it's interesting how we have this one story of Deborah, and she's kind of like defies like when you look at Deborah, it's like interesting how every sort of like rationality you can think of, she kind of breaks it in some way. And kind of talking about how like a lot of psychologists, if you see some of the videos I was going through, because I don't want to go through it today because it's a lot, but females can express male traits. like leadership and all these sort of things, they can express that. It's not always normal for people to stand out in that degree, because like when you look at the judges, like a lot of the traits they had weren't just like normal like people like traits. Like they were super normal of whatever trait they had and how they led people. It was super heightened. Like it wasn't really just to the point where like a normal person like with Samson, his his strength, like that's not just a normal thing. Like that was far beyond most capacities. It's kind of funny because I wasn't gonna go on this rant, but it's kind of funny because like I remember in my physics class, like we're about like I'm about like two or 3 years of the program, and we have a rather abnormally large like physics program, I guess, for whatever reason. Like there's like 70 kids in my class. Like you think that's like 70, like wow, that's a lot, but like for like a university, like that's actually 70. Like that's actually kind of a lot to have like 70 physics nerds like all like actually stick it through past junior year. Like it's not always that typical. Usually class sizes are much smaller, and this is one class. And it's funny because like there was like literally 10 females in the room, and they all sat in one corner. And it was just like so funny to kind of see that, how it's like, yeah. And they were all best friends and all this and that. And it was just so funny how like the rest, like it was just like but anyway, moving on. When you look at Deborah, she's kind of like there's normals of how people progress, right? There's normals about how men and women tend to go things. Now, on the one hand, Deborah's not unique in that sense. It doesn't mean that she's the only person that can do that, right? She's not the only person that's unique, that she was the only female that God picked to do that. Like, we can find that there's a lot of prophets in the Old Testament. You can find we can find in the New Testament how there are different women who are leadership roles and different things like that. But that's just kind of bringing it up because some people will probably say, well, she's the only one, she's the exception to the rule. And then the question is like, well, why is there such a heavy exception? Because that's like one of the weird things I kind of get. I get worried when people like have their theology and then they start making up exceptions and exceptions. It's like, if there's an exception, there needs to be a pretty good reason why there's an exception, right? Because if Deborah's like the only female leader and she's like the only one in the Old Testament, like first off, we can show how that's a contradiction. But if we do that, and it's like to say that she's the exception, like by what criteria? God's very consistent with what he does. And the whole fact that we have this one exception and then like, oh, well, she does this, but there are other prophets, they're just exceptions too. And you're like, it starts getting a little bit fishy that maybe what you were thinking about before probably wasn't right. Because if you have to keep making exceptions to the rules of how like God works, you really got to wonder how consistent is your God if it makes sense one day but doesn't make sense the next day. Yeah, so that's just another thing too, is like, other people did fulfill a lot of the other things in scripture that she did too. Like there were other prophets, she was a songwriter, and there's a lot of other things, like, there's a lot of other people that did fulfill some other aspects of it. Just to kind of talk about the range of like traits and different things like that. It can fall on male and female, just on general, some people tend to lean towards one direction or the other. Okay, so these are just some of the videos. You can watch them in your free time if you want. The slides are up so you can look at them. Then we're going to talk about this really weird topic. Talk about modesty. Okay? Let's I'm going to offend everybody today, just so you guys are aware. I'm not going to offend just one group, okay? Anyone want to read? One thing I want to bring up here is, it's interesting how first things first, Paul actually mentions how men shouldn't be doing this with anger. And then he goes on to talk about the females, which is why it's like another hint that like there was probably some sort of marital issues going on, which he's addressing, not some general statement about, society, okay? Which I just love how people tend to ignore that. Like, I just like however these people were addressing, it's one issue, but like clearly these men were getting angry at something. The fact that they're raising their hands and they're angry, God or whatever this is, like Paul's addressing some issue that's going on, right? It's more than just about male and female. Like there's a lot going on here. Okay, so now what is modesty? No perfume. Self-check of humility. Okay. I like that one the most so far, but you'll see why that's actually kind of interesting, because you bring up a self-checkout. It's kind of interesting. First things first, the Greek word modesty actually means to orderly, which is kind of interesting because this could imply that there might have been something else going on in the church, that it's not just addressing, because like our modern notion of modesty, like that's what we have this sort of thing that the word modesty was made much later. But the actual Greek word modesty is literally comes from this word here that literally just means orderly. It could just be that they were dressing a certain way that wasn't appropriate for church. That literally could have been the issue. The reason why that's kind of interesting, because, you know, they could have been wearing something that's distracting and stuff like that, and we'll get into that in a whole thing. But the first hand, would you wear a bathing suit to church? If it's a service at the beach, okay, maybe. But I mean, like, you know, how about like a funeral? Would you wear your pajamas to a funeral? Probably not, right? You'd probably very disrespectful. You know, you don't do those little things. And that could be one thing that Paul is addressing here is, you know, the whole fact that the way that they're dressing, there might have been something about it that wasn't actually orderly for the church, which is one way to look at it, right? Then we get to this other issue. A lot of people talk about modesty and they say, okay, well, like modesty is just not being attractive, right? You have to some people basically try to cover themselves up and be like, if there's anything attractive about you, that's even remotely attractive, it's bad, it's wrong, you know, like, right? Of course, some people have this problem more than others, apparently. But, you know, some people have this sort of idea, right? That modesty has to do specifically with just attractiveness. That's the only, you know, portion, you know, you got to keep that under control somehow. Okay. Second question. On Sunday, you're supposed to wear your best, right? That'd be nice, right? That's generally what people say. So a lot of people come in, you know, nice clothing and all this and that. You say, okay. In general, wearing fancy clothes makes people look more attractive. Like if you wear a suit, you probably have some money, and that's generally seen as attractive, or maybe like generally people wear dresses and suits and stuff. They just look better, right? Okay. Shouldn't we dress simply then? Because if we're gonna dress up, doesn't that make us all look more attractive? Okay. Then if that's true, then we have the other problem, because if you look at other people who are dressed up more and you look at them now and you're stereotyping, they're less attractive, and all the people that look like you, they find them more attractive. So realistically, it doesn't actually matter what you do. You can't define modesty in this way because it contradicts itself regardless. Because there's literally nothing you do. If modesty is solely about the purpose of attraction, there's some issues that go along with that. You can't really, there's problems. Now, there's another issue of modesty, and it's more about keeping one's body separate from marriage. That is whole other issue about modesty that comes into play here. The reason why is because if you ever go through Leviticus 18, Leviticus 18 is basically talks about all the sexual purity laws in the Old Testament, stuff like that. That's like the majority of it's confined to. Half the chapter literally just revolves around itself. It's just saying you should not see this person naked. It's literally what half the chapter is about. If you ever go through and read it, it's just like don't look at the nakedness of your cousin's brother, or don't look at the nakedness of your mother's in-law, or like that's literally what the majority of the chapter is talking about. And it's almost to the point where it's just like, excuse me, like, Moses, did you really have to go in this much detail specifying? You could have just said, don't look at anybody besides your spouse naked. Like, yeah, there's obviously a lot of issues. Like, and he actually goes through and explicitly defines like almost every conceivable situation you can think of seeing someone else naked. It's got to be in there somehow, you know? Okay. Oh. So that's one whole issue. Okay. Now we get to Matthew 5, 27 to 28. I have a question for you guys. I don't want anyone to feel embarrassed, because this is kind of a it's not always straightforward. It's not always obvious. I have a serious question for you guys. How many of you people know that females lust?
Who?
Yeah, right. In case you weren't aware, right? In case you weren't aware, just so you guys know, right? It's not like guys are the only ones that lust. So like when you look at this chapter, he's addressing males, which arguably, like, again, talking about traits in general, men tend to go off more than females in general. Not always true, but it's not just confined to males, right? And this is why we were joking about earlier, like the whole issue that, if you're talking about modesty, well, shouldn't we technically be talking about both? Because on the one hand, if we're talking about modesty, like, this argument could apply both ways. And you hear something, sir? So that's another thing we're going to get into now. So we get to Romans 14, 20 to 21. So here's an interesting thing that Paul talked about, because when you read the chapter of Romans, it's kind of interesting how he's addressing the issue of eating meat. This is one of those interesting things because you could just go back to Daniel if you really wanted to. And the reason why is because in those days, when you went to your butcher, oftentimes what would happen is they would cut part of the meat and they'd offer it to idols and different things like that. So if you were going to go over to you were going to go get some meat, and all of a sudden, well, you had to worry about whether or not this meat was blessed by some priest of some other religion or something like that. So that became a problem. And for the Jews, you weren't supposed to do that. You were also supposed to, like, for many Jews, you were supposed to have like kosher meat. It was supposed to be killed a specific way and blessed by a Jewish priest. So when you get to Rome and different things like that, this becomes the issue that people are dealing with, because on the one hand, like, they're trying not to defile themselves ceremonially, and there's all these traditions and stuff. But there's an interesting sort of subtlety that comes along with that. On the one hand, like, you could make that argument completely from the Old Testament, talking about Daniel and probably talking about other, like, going to Leviticus and different things. Because Daniel, that's the argument he used about why he didn't want to eat the king's meat, right? But would that be a contradiction then? Because why would Paul be saying the opposite? Why doesn't he use Daniel's argument? A little hint. We have the Holy Spirit. Because on the one hand, there's this issue of, like, defilement, and, like, in the Old Testament, you literally just walk past a graveyard and you're already like defiled before God. Like, and there's different ceremonial reasons as to why that is. Like, on the one hand, like, Judaism, like the way it was expressed is your entire life centered around purity and different things like that. Like, literally your whole entire life. Like, we think of God and we think of religion. For the Jewish people today, that literally didn't have any distinction. Like, literally, like, everything you did had a religious aspect to it. So, and a lot of that was also to kind of help the individuals to, like, keep it, like, themselves conscious about God. And it's, like, funny, like, when you go through the book of Judges, you'll see real quickly how, like, crazy everyone was and how everyone slowly, like, kind of detached themselves. And it's, like, interesting how the cultures, like, shift, and everything you do centers around God and and holiness and things. And that's why like when we talk about clean music and different things like that, it's like, what do you put in your life really affects how you express your spirituality. Now, in context here, you talked about don't cause someone to stumble if they eat meat, right? So again, on the New Testament side, we have the Holy Spirit, and Paul actually does make another argument too, because again, this is probably something that some of the people probably ask him, because they're like, oh, well, this person ate like this meat and it's offered to this God and all this and that. And I wish I put it in thinking about it, but he makes a reference to, there are no other gods and different things like that. And those people, they're making an invalid argument from the point of view where it's like, they believe that Apollo or something like that is like, they're literally sacrificing to this God, and we believe in this other God over here. That's not, like, Paul's basically like saying, like, there's only one God. There's no other gods. All these other things, that, it's not really that powerful, or, like they're really just making up something bigger than what it actually is, right? But there's an issue of consciousness here, because if you feel like you shouldn't be, like, for a person of the day, if they feel conscious about that, like if they grew up that way, if it's ingrained in their culture, there's nothing wrong about not eating that type of meat. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. I mean, on the one hand, like those gods, he's like basically talked about those gods, like, they're making a bad argument on one hand, but also the whole issue that, we have the Holy Spirit, and like within us, we're not defiled just from like doing something bad. Like, we're clean under Jesus and different things like that. So, the reason why that becomes kind of interesting is because there's an issue of the conscious that comes along here. Because okay, I won't go there. We'll talk about coffee. No. Trying to think of a nice example. I do too, but I don't want. I want to save that for another day. I don't want to say something without a whole bunch of context so people just don't like freak out. I don't know, what example did you have? Because I'm trying to think of a mild example. Which mild example do you have? And that's kind of another thing too I was trying to get into, because there's like some people, like, they don't, some people have different psychological things where they can't be around a certain person, or they can't go to like some people are terrified of clowns or different things like that. Like, some people just have like random things about their lives that they don't feel comfortable around. And for those people, like, it may not be a big issue for you, but for someone else's life, like, I won't forget, I was watching this one TV show, and I forgot, like, it was basically a bunch of chefs, and one of the guys, like, training everyone else, he's like yelling at him, and he said he just like got into this one guy's face and said, like, he said like a man or something like that, the way he yelled at him in his face or something. So he went back to his dorm, whatever, he left, and he came like, a few hours later to come talk to him, to the head chef in the office, and apparently he said, I don't feel comfortable because that was something I had to deal with my dad in the past, and you saying that to me brought up some awful memories. And it's kind of interesting how you wouldn't think it sets someone off in a certain way, but it does. And that's kind of what Paul is talking about in this sort of area we're talking about meat and stuff like that. Because on the one hand, all because you're okay with something, it doesn't mean it's not going to affect other people, right? The reason why that's important is because on the one hand, we're talking about modesty and different things like that, some people have different issues and different sins they're dealing with. So realistically, if you're presenting yourself a certain way, you know, they might not be, you know, not everyone's gonna be aggressive trying to go after you in the moment, but they might be having certain issues that they're dealing with, and you presenting yourself to them in that sort of way, even if you didn't mean to, is causing them to have some sort of internal issue. There is another side of this too, is that lust isn't your problem, right? If someone else is lusting, that's your fault. That's their fault, right? Because they have issues in their heart, right? But there's always that side thing where it's like, if there's something that you can do to help another person who's new in the faith and things like that, you want to be mindful at all times of how you can help them grow. Because if they're, you know, like right now they might be dealing with this issue, hopefully down the road the issues will kind of go away and they'll be fine. But you don't want to cause someone to actually get deeper and deeper into sin. Like I was talking to somebody the other day, and you know, he was talking about how he got into drugs and different things like that, and how he was trying to go to church, but then whenever he was around some friends, he gets sucked back into a bunch of issues. And realistically, he just came to the point where he had to cut some things off. And until he, you know, until he was mature enough to actually realize about what his life is and something like that, like it just wasn't going to happen. And he was honest about his own life, but like that's what you got to do. And it's hard, but like you always have to be mindful. You don't want to set someone up in a situation where they're going to get back into their sin. And of course, that takes a lot of self-sacrifice on one hand, because that means you actually have to love your neighbor and think about them. You know what that also means? You actually have to know that person. You have to know what they're going through. You have to know what they're struggling with. And next week we'll talk about prophetic things in the Bible, and we'll talk about some prophetic applications of where you find females in the Bible, and in some of the most interesting, fun ways. Like a couple of these we talked about in Bible study, we'll review them, but we'll talk about some fun stuff.